Welcome to the Backyard Professor videos. In my analysis, in my research into the New Testament, into the nature of the New Testament, into the various writings that we find in the New Testament, and in the various scholarly literature on the New Testament, I'm constantly running across very interesting scholarly ideas that cause us to challenge our assumptions. And while this makes some people extremely uncomfortable, I find it extremely delightful and challenging. What made Hugh Nibley, the LDS scholar, so wonderful was his ability to read across the spectrum, whether in the ancient world, the medieval world, or the modern world. Whether it was Mormon authors, Methodist authors, Roman Catholic authors, atheists, ancient Egyptians, it did not matter who he read. He was able to give us a much more realistic, broader picture because he read so widely in the literature. What makes the Neal A. Maxwell Institute, now housed at BYU, so wonderful in their researches is because they have carried on the Nibley legacy. Perhaps Nibley was influenced by B.H. Roberts' attitude as well, who loved to explore the other religions and their teachings and their ideas and the way they understood the Bible, not as a final method of truth and proof, but as a comparison. What helps us understand our faith stronger is exactly having the comparative religious approach in our hearts and minds as we study the great literatures of the world. The interesting thing is, Joseph Smith said, by proving contraries, truth is made manifest. You have comparisons which play off each other. That's the beauty and power of studying the scriptures in this manner, instead of only in one groove and one tradition. I believe it was Nietzsche, I'll have to look this up, but my nephew reminded me of this the other night on the telephone when I was talking to him. Nietzsche said, if you want a boy to learn something, a young boy to learn something, don't surround him with men who all have the same attitude and same kind of thinking. Surround him with men who each have different beliefs and ideas, and then the boy will receive an education. There's great power in that, in many respects. I've run across a very interesting idea that I'm going to share with you today. This is by Helmut Kester in his Ancient Christian Gospels, Their History and Development. This text was written by Trinity Press International, first published in 1990. Kester is one of the great New Testament scholars. He was John H. Morrison Professor of New Testament and Wynne Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Harvard Divinity School. Anybody who studies the New Testament from the scholarly, careful introduction with the New Testament analysis based in history, etc., will know Helmut Kester's name. They know he is a thoroughly qualified scholar to deal with the New Testament issues, and I really like his ideas. I like his style of writing. He is one who opened my eyes to the fact that we do have 4 Gospels in the New Testament, but there were over 80 Gospels known. And the reason for selecting just those 4 is not so obvious. In fact, there's argument that on one end of the coin that 4 is too many. In the canonical debates that are occurring right now. And there's other people who are saying, oh, no. More of these old ancient Gospels that have now been rediscovered, and they're being cross-checked and analyzed, they should be added into the canon. So there's real no consensus yet, still to this day, what is canonical and what's not. But the very term gospel, Kester has demonstrated, is problematic within the Gospels themselves. It's very interesting. He says on page 9, The question arises whether the authors of the Gospel of the New Testament understood their writings as Gospels, or whether the established technical meaning of the term the proclaimed message about Christ's death and resurrection had any effect on the conception and structure of their works. The use of the noun gospel in the Gospels of the New Testament is puzzling. In the Gospel of John, for instance, as well as in the Johannine epistles, neither noun or verb are ever used. The absence of those terms in the Johannine writings is one among other pieces of evidence which prove that the beginnings of the Johannine community lay outside the scope of the Pauline mission area. Because in Paul's use of the gospel, he uses it different than John did. See again, each different author in the New Testament times had their particular interpretation and emphasis. Kester goes on, but the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, belong to this realm, and they are dependent upon it. And even here, the use of the term gospel is by no means easy to understand. In fact, it remains somewhat enigmatic, and moreover is very different in each of the three synoptic gospels. In Luke, in the Lucan writings, the verb, this is on page 10 of Kester, the verb is used in both parts of the Lucan work, but the noun gospel as a noun is only used in the book of Acts. In both the Gospel of Luke and in the Acts of the Apostles, the verb can mean simply to announce something. So it may not refer to the gospel of the death of Jesus Christ when it's used. It could simply mean the announcement of any good message. Hey, your mom got home earlier. Oh, hey, Paul's back from his missionary journey. That could be declared as a gospel. The gospel is a proclamation of a good message, not necessarily the gospel of Jesus Christ as the way to salvation. So there's ambiguous ways they use the gospel, and this is reflected in the various Greek terms that they use for the gospel, whether as a noun or a verb, etc. So it's kind of fascinating, isn't it? In most instances, it is used to designate the Christian missionary proclamation. In many cases, the verb has no direct object. It means either simply to preach or to preach the gospel. The action of preaching is what the word can mean. If Luke does not use the noun gospel in the first part of his work, he also does not conceive of his own writing as a gospel. Now this is interesting, isn't it? On the contrary, in the prologue to his work, Luke 1:1-4, he speaks of others who have tried to compose a narrative. And the Greek word specifically says narrative. There's nothing about a gospel as such, as we pretend or assume to know is that genre of literature. Luke never called it that at all. About the events, the pragmata. This is a narrative of events, and this may very well be the title which scribes would have given to this work. In Matthew, the absence of the noun of Luke compared seems odd because the Gospel of Mark, employed by Luke as a source, had used the noun gospel repeatedly. So it's kind of interesting to compare how Matthew uses this. Even Matthew reproduces only a few of the Markan occurrences of the term gospel. On the other hand, Matthew uses the term several times in non-Markan contexts, and in 2 instances adds the phrase, "and he preached the gospel of the kingdom," to a Markan summary statement about the activity of Jesus. Well, these are very clearly redactional Matthean passages. This raises the question of why the author of the Gospel of Matthew, who was quite familiar with the term gospel, does not reproduce the term when it occurs in a number of the Markan passages which Matthew copied from Mark. Why does Matthew leave the term out entirely? The use of the term in Mark 13:10 and 14:9, also in 16:15, corresponds to the conventional missionary terminology of the Pauline churches. Matthew, however, in the 2 instances in which he reproduces passages from Mark in which the term gospel appears, what Matthew does is he adds the demonstrative "this" to the word gospel. and in the first instance also the qualifying genitive of the kingdom. So here's how Matthew changes the interpretation from Mark. Thus, he understands also the passages in questions as references to a more specific message than Mark did. Again, a different emphasis, a different interpretation, a selection, a deselection. Each author has their own interpretation in their narrative about what is going on. What message is meant is not immediately clear in Matthew 26:13. The phrase gospel of the kingdom appears independently of Mark. For Matthew, this was the gospel of the kingdom. But Mark didn't have that interpretation. He had something different. All modern commentators agree, though, that the words "this gospel" in Matthew 26:13 cannot refer to Matthew's book. They know that. Well, in Matthew 4:23 and 9:25, in these two passages, as well as in Matthew 24:14, the meaning of this phrase is evident. It is the message that Jesus is preaching. That is, the message of the coming of the kingdom of heaven. It is Jesus' message, as it is already was the message of John the Baptist, and we can compare Matthew 4:17 and 3:2. But it is not the gospel about Jesus' death and resurrection. Matthew never uses the term gospel in that sense. Isn't that fascinating? You can see the different interpretive emphases between the different writers of the different narratives that we have about Jesus, that we call Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, etc. Anciently, that may not have been the proper designation. And this is a common way to designate the gospel in the Pauline churches. So again, Paul's emphasis is also different from the different synoptics. It's very interesting here. It is characteristic that the term gospel is also missing in the commissioning of the disciples at the end of Matthew's gospel. Have you ever noticed that before? Isn't that fascinating? Here's the reference, Matthew 28:18 through 20. The difference between Matthew 28:18 through 20 and Mark 16:15 is striking, he says. While in the albeit secondary ending of Mark, Jesus commands the disciples to go into all the world to proclaim the gospel, Matthew reports Jesus' mission command as a charge to the 11 to make all the nations disciples, to baptize them, and to teach them to observe everything that he had taught. The very distinctive understanding of, quote, gospel, unquote, in Matthew may be the reason for his omission of the term in many of the Markan passages. They each have a different comprehension of a broad meaning or a narrow meaning of the gospel, and it changes what it means. Isn't that interesting? Now, in relation to Mark, he says, and this is on page 12, the use of the term gospel in Mark raises several problems. Does the term belong to the original text of Mark in the passages of which it occurs in the extant manuscripts? What is the content of the gospel in Mark? Do we know what that is? Maybe, maybe not. It is by no means evident that Matthew read the term in his text of Mark, where it now appears in our Markan manuscripts. One is tempted to argue that the term has been inserted into a number of Markan passages by a later redactor. In other words, the value of understanding the actual Greek manuscript history here comes into play, because the differences between the earliest Greek manuscripts of Matthew and Mark are some of those differences on where that very word gospel is not in the earliest manuscripts of the Mark. So, of course, Matthew, in taking that information from Mark, also did not have the term gospel in his manuscript. But in the later dated manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, we find that term gospel in those. So someone's been tampering with the manuscripts to produce a later theological information and interpretation that supposedly the ancients were supposed to have. But they may not have had that. Interesting. The manuscript history is very important to study in the New Testament. What this does for us is it helps us see why there are differences between the various ways the Synoptic Gospels present the Gospels, as opposed to the Gospel of John, as opposed to the various letters of Paul. It helps us realize there really is differences that make a difference, but not necessarily contradictions that prove these are all just made-up tales. No, they're dealing with real events, all right, but there really are differences. Mark himself does never thereby designate his own work as a gospel. Ancient writings either begin with a formal dedication describing the purpose of the book, like Luke Acts does, or with a sentence marking the first subject treated. The latter is the case in Mark 1 and 1, especially when this passage is seen as a pointer to Mark 1, 14 and 15. It is not a cryptic phrase which mysteriously suggests to the modern interpreter that the author somehow wanted to imply that his work was a gospel. That's not what Mark is saying at all. Rather, the sentence of Mark 1:1 says that the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection and death began with the preaching of John the Baptist and with Jesus' own call for repentance. Thus, there is no indication whatsoever that either Mark or any of the other authors of the Gospels of the New Testament thought that, quote, gospel, as a term, would be an appropriate title for the literature that they produced. Isn't that interesting? Because of the analysis of the manuscript history of the Greek manuscripts, and because of the actual descriptions in these narratives that we have of what these writers, whoever they were doing with these synoptic gospels, they were not intent on producing gospels. They were simply providing narratives based on the oral tradition about this Jesus fellow, about his life and mission and teaching and preaching. It was later on, Kester goes on through a very good analysis of the early Christian fathers, Ignatius, Hippolytus, Polycarp, Irenaeus, Tertullian, etc., Clement I and Clement II. He shows how it was later in the 2nd century A.D. that those early Christian commentators, the fathers, began to call these narratives that they had inherited from 100 years before, they began to call these Gospels. But the original authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, weren't intent on writing them as Gospels. I think that's kind of interesting. I think it's a fascinating way to help us appreciate that when we hear the word gospel, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what the ancients understood. We have no right to take our modern interpretation and put it back onto the ancients and expect them to have the same understanding as we do. That simply doesn't work that way. That's improper methodology. So that's my idea for the day. I hope you enjoyed it. I will continue on analyzing various things. I want to get into I found some very interesting information on the personalities. As it's reflected in the Gospels themselves, the personalities of the different authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whom we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how those personalities colored their perceptions about what they were doing, and how this changes the various interpretations, and why that produces contradictions and supposed problems in the Gospels. They're not really problems at all, because they're based on the oral tradition. Oral tradition never had an original, pristine, exact, dogmatic formulation that one had to follow. No, the stories were told in various ways with various different kinds of emphasis. And that is That is why the various Gospels have different materials. That is why some of them seem diametrically opposite to each other. That is one explanation of why we have two different contradictory stories of the death of Judas Iscariot. I've read where critics think that just proves all of this is hokey. Oh no, it does not. It does nothing of the sort. There really were two different traditions of Judas Iscariot and his death. But that doesn't mean it's all made up. That just means the one tradition understood some details differently than the other tradition, and his death was remembered from someone in one manner as opposed to someone on the other. And now, recently, with the new finding of the Gospel of Judas anyway, the entire concept of Judas Iscariot is being reassessed once again. You see, nothing is ever final and settled. We don't have the full picture and the full impact of ancient Christianity, ancient Jewish Christianity, ancient Gentile Christianity. We are still learning something new absolutely all the time. And this is what gets me excited, is because it's not the same old, stagnant, boring interpretation. There is a much wider, much more energetic, living conceptualization of absolutely every phase of the gospel in early Christianity than we can even imagine. And these are now coming out. And it's really exciting to see what they're saying. So, thanks for watching my videos, and I will see you in the next video.